It's so good to be here with all of you, dear followers, in the month of August. But we noticed from last year that August has awesome participation. So it seems that people are more relaxed on vacation, whatever. We have so many viewers in August that we decided to do this episode in August. And right, Martin, it was your idea to invite these renowned speakers.
Absolutely. We've had some really interesting and stimulating discussions with both Elise and Gustavo in the past. So we thought it might be useful to come back, have another little chat, and this time to combine the expertise that Elise brings, which is very definitely around meetings and organizing and managing meetings, and Gustavo's experience, which is all around organization culture. And we thought a fitting topic might be the idea of building a meetings positive organization culture. So we thought that could be a stimulating conversation with two world experts in the respective fields.
That's awesome. That's really the case. And we normally start these episodes with a question, right, Martin?
Yeah, the question, it's not always heard very positively, Paul, as we discovered in one of our episodes, but that's fine. That's the nature of live broadcast and just engaging with people in our fireside chat format. Both Elise and Gustavo will have answered this question for us before, but more than happy to hear any new takes they have on it. Something that people may not always know about you, that is just a little bit interesting.
Sure. Elise?
Well, let's see. I have today a growing collection of necklaces with double-headed war axes on them.
Oh.
Inspired by Wilbert von Vrie, who is a meeting historian.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who pointed out that the modern gavel is a descendant from the double-headed war axe. And so I pointed this out in a training once, and I told this story, and I ended up with a collection of these gavels from Wilbert, who has them custom made. And my dad decided that then I collect double-headed war axes, and he sends me necklaces and t-shirts and giant Viking mugs. This is not the case, but now you know, you too can send me double-headed war axe things.
Super. Wow. Oh, I love it. Nice one.
Can you beat this, Gustavo?
No, but that's not a competition, it's a contribution. So I'm going to talk about a personal story that very few people know. That was a life-changing event, which I got lost in the Andes, like exploring a mountain. I got lost from a team, and then I had to survive one night that it felt like a week in the middle of the wilderness, without proper clothing, without food, without water, without anything, without lights, in a place that I then realized it was full of mountain lions. Luckily, they weren't able to visit, or they didn't think I was the right kind of food for them. So it was a very life-changing, and since then I adopted the idea of getting lost on purpose. No, so now I go biking, and sometimes I take a turn without knowing where I am and keep biking for miles, and then I say, well, now I need to figure out how to get my way home, back home.
Very interesting. Wow. A lot of crikey, we could have a conversation just on that one, Gustavo. As the implications of that for organization culture could be fairly significant.
Yes, and especially meeting culture, right?
Oh yeah, wow.
Yeah, there was a meeting with myself,
dips
but in
into
the end, it's all
chaos.
about mindset. No, so it's like if you don't stop and pause, like you're dead, literally.
Yeah, it evokes something pretty interesting, though. The idea of going someplace that you don't know, that you're not familiar with, and getting more and more comfortable with where it might take you. What an interesting idea. Elise, any experience along those lines from a meetings perspective?
Well, I think it's part of what leads to the advice that we often give clients, which is to, just relax. Relax on the agendas, relax on all of these trying to over control and constrain things and thinking that that's what will make it look successful. You know, sometimes come up with a provocative question and go for a walk, right? Is one of the better ways in which to get lost in the terrain of possibility, right? You know, that's what makes meetings worth doing, when you discover that you can overcome the mountain lions together.
Absolutely. And building on that, I like the idea that, yeah, people think that when meetings are chaotic because there's no outcome, that they basically need to jump into the other extreme, which is basically over control. But maybe the solution is learn to navigate the chaos rather than avoid it or try to eliminate it, because that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, and that's that I'm conjuring what both of you are saying to me is setting all kinds of bells ringing in my head here about meeting positive culture, because is it not the case that we so often hear negativity as soon as we mention the word meeting, that it conjures up all this kind of ferment of negativity? But what both of you are saying in very different ways, but aligning, is there's massive positivity in navigating the unknown, the unfamiliar. And are there lessons that we could take from that idea if we wanted to build meeting positive workspaces and workplaces?
Well, I think you have to start with being a little bit comfortable with the unknown and the unfamiliar if you're going to go from a place that is status quo to a place that's meeting positive. Just because the status quo discussion around meetings is so negative. So even embracing the idea that we might think this is something we can play with is an unknown and risky place to go, and yet a delightful one.
But where's the risk? Where's the risk in that, Elise, from your experience? Why would people do on that?
It's social. So people talk about like meetings being determined based on, lack of agenda or having an agenda, managing it to 15 minutes or not managing it to 15 minutes, having these sort of organizational wide rules that are then enforced as being the keys to success. And it doesn't ever work. It never works to just put in these bands and these top level constraints, because the real challenge is not the absence or presence of dictated agreements of performance. The real challenge is meetings are a social gathering event for teams. And you walk into the room, and the way that you behave in the room is the way that the group in the room behaves. So for you to come in and say, hey, you know what, let's have some fun here. Hey, let's play some music. You know what, we're just going to put a question up and see what happens. Why don't we take this for a walk? Anytime you do that, you run the risk of the rest of the group thinking that you are unprofessional, judging them. Are you saying we've been doing it wrong, right? Wasting their time. You're dealing with social risk. It's like you're trying to bring another country's culture into your parents' dining table. Good luck with that. So that's the risk. And the framing question, the unknown, is how do you step boldly into the place where you don't know how to survive quite? You don't know that environment and thrive in it.
And Gustavo, isn't that the essence of organization culture? It's this idea of preformed expectations, preformed rules, things that we conform to, things that we adhere to. And are we at the risk? Does culture potentially crush creativity? And in a meetings context, does prevailing culture in the organizations kill the possibility of doing stuff better or differently or both?
Mm-hmm. Lots of things to unpack there, trying to see where I get started. First of all, I think that I 1000% agree with Elise many times people want to put too much process in place, and that doesn't help, and especially because it comes with a band-aid approach. So we're trying to fix things rather than try to understand what's the real underlying cause. So that's when culture comes to life. First, what are the mindsets, the issues that are affecting meetings? So to your point, they're not things that are negative or positive. We can turn negative things into a good thing, or we can do the opposite. So it's up to us. There are many types of culture. I'm going to try to keep it simple here, but for example, there are certain organizations that have what I call more of a tribal, like a friendly type of culture, in which those meetings tend to happen very organically. Let's take IKEA or Zappos. IKEA has huge staircases in most of their offices that promote impromptu encounters for people to have what they call in Swedish a fika, coffee, and then meet with your friends, chat about life, and one things get to another. That's how they roll. The opposite extreme, very aggressive culture like Amazon, Netflix, they have very structured, rigid, efficient-oriented meetings. So, for example, in Netflix, meetings are never meant to make decisions. They are very structured. They have always an agenda. They always start and end on time. And if you don't show up on time, you can get fired. So very rigid. Amazon has this idea of the 2-pizza rule, never invite more people to a meeting than those that you can fit to a pizza. So they want to keep it small. So depending on the culture that affects that, what I see is that many times companies have a very, for example, what I call fearless, very top-down, controlling, lot of red tape culture. They want to adopt meetings in a more creative or innovative or free flow, and then they fail because basically that's not how they roll. They're not prepared. They don't know how to facilitate. They're not ready to have conversations that are courageous or difficult, or they're not. I mean, if you invite them to go for a walk and let's have a walking meeting, they say, "Oh, what is this?" So that's not going to happen. No? So I think that's every organization has the meetings that their culture deserves. That doesn't mean that they don't deserve better.
Wow. So that's and so Elise, I'd bounce back to you on that one. So what I'm actually hearing from both of you is that the already existing culture of the organization gets reflected in its meetings. But Elise, I think if I understood your point correctly, that by adopting different types of meetings, we have the possibility to maybe shift a little bit the underlying organization culture. Have we got a hen and an egg scenario going on here between meetings and org culture?
Always, right? Yeah. So, and I think Gustavo and I probably hugely overlap in terms of the things that we work on with clients on, because, you know, while I'm not a huge fan of giant top-down mandates, it does require you to make some new agreements if you're looking to shift your culture. And those agreements get proven and enacted and iterated on when the teams come together. So that's the meeting, right? So the meeting, in terms of cultural shift, is the one place where everybody is all in the same room practicing what they just said they were going to do. It's the one place where you can, you know, get those iterations in and do that time to say, yes, indeed, we are in fact going to hear from everybody. We are in fact going to write down what we agreed to do, right? So while the meeting is a reflection of the culture, it's also a creator of the culture at the same time, which is why I focus on it as an intervention point, but it is by no means something that stands on its own. It's also a fabulous diagnostic tool. So if you look at some of those top-down hierarchical organizations, they're breaking down, right? That, you know, a Taylorist approach to work is not scaling, and it's not agile enough for the current dynamic environment that we live in. And so we see this giant proliferation of the ad hoc meeting. You know, all the people who have to check in with so-and-so and so-and-so. And in those cases, those meetings are a symptom of the existing processes being unfit for purpose. You can't get things done in the structure, in the red tape that need to be done. So therefore, you have to meet with a bunch of people to figure out how to move forward, because there is no mechanism for moving forward in that structure. So the cultural gridlock that happens there because because you're so stuck in all of these patterns and have literally no time to get out of them, has to be shifted by creating new agreements and iterating your way through it.
Wow. Gustavo, that bounces into your realm. Is that your experience? That if an organization is struggling with its sense of its own culture, have you seen evidence, or do you see evidence that people's meeting habits shift and change to enable them to deal with some of these bottlenecks or glitches in their underlying culture?
Definitely. One thing that for me it's important to note is if you want to improve the culture meeting of an organization, you need to start within the organization. So it's about improving certain meetings, because we talk about culture, but then there are the subcultures. Yep. So I think that where many companies fail is try to have a one-size-fits-all approach and improve all the meetings. So take Shopify, which I respect the organization in many aspects, but recently they decided to eliminate all recurring meetings. So while many people celebrated that, oh, what this is brave, this efficiency, it feels like, well, it all depends. If we're meeting at the manufacturing, they don't have manufacturing, but let's say a company have manufacturing facilities, they need to meet every day to check, hey, are the machines working? So you cannot assume that every group of organizations should behave exactly the same. So I think it's better to start improving those agreements that Elise mentioned on a team or department basis, rather than to have a CEO said, hey, this is the way to go, boom, and we change everything overnight.
Yeah, I see you nodding vigorously there, Elise, and actually what that conjured in my mind is the idea that you use in Lucid very strongly, which is this idea of meeting flows or meeting streams. You know, that putting different streams of meetings with different purposes and different reasons for meeting, putting them together into a natural workflow, and then that can shift across different parts of the organization. Am I reading that correctly from your point of view, Elise?
Yeah, absolutely. And I find the Shopify example to be a fabulous train wreck of an example as well, because, you know, so there are basically 3 levels at which you can work on a meeting culture that's gone in a direction that you don't like, that's not working well or healthy for your organization. And that first level is the intervention level. And that's the level that your C-suite tends to operate at. They'll do things like have a meeting ban or a meeting free week, or say, hey, Freedom Fridays are very popular, right? No meetings on Friday. We're seeing the same kinds of intervention level things in the return to office conversation. Everybody has to be in the office 3 days a week, regardless of purpose. You know, so some of these things, and you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that's ineffective. It really needs to happen at the team level. It needs to be purpose driven. There needs to be a reason why we're doing these things. Mm-hmm. But at the C-suite level, they can't do those level of details, right? The Shopify C-suite is not going to go in and say which of those recurring meetings need to happen. So the intervention approach makes sense when you look at it from their perspective, but finding interventions that are guardrails, that are about stating clarity of intent, mm-hmm. And then giving it to the teams to do the implementation step. So that's intervention. Then the teams need to implement exactly what you said. Here are the meetings we need to run and why. Here are the ones where we're going to come together. Here's the ones where we can do this online. And hey, guess what? Half of them we don't need because we can do this by Slack or email in our system of truth, right? And then the final step, so intervention, C-suite, implementation, team, department, project level, iteration, right? Where are the feedback loops? Where are the learning loops? So that culture can get continuously closer and closer to the culture you aspire to have. Because these are not one and done things.
Oh, yeah. So I really like that idea of the 3 levels, because again, when you're speaking there, Elise, what's conjuring in my mind is this idea of difference, that mm-hmm. different groups, different levels within the organization need to do things in really different ways. But Gustavo, that sounds like that poses a challenge then for the organization culture, in how do you bring all those three levels together? And probably more importantly, how do you hold them together if they are very different from each other?
Yeah, I think that the way to hold everything together through iteration, I think that all the three steps are real critical. But in the end, at least in my experience, I don't know if Elise it goes through the thing, the iterative part is the most difficult, because that first of all, it's removing the perfectionist mindset that many leaders have, that they want to find this solution and move on, versus, hey, we don't know what's going to work for us, because once again, copying what other companies are doing, it's never the right way to go. You have to create your own practices and norms and rules and styles. But I think also the iterative part requires to understand that maybe when you start something, you have certain assumptions, but then reality proves you wrong, or maybe the context changes and you need to continue to adjust. And I think this is, for example, Elise talked about the return to the office. This is something that rather than iterate, people are pivoting from black to white without any clear reasons. So recently, the senior VP from Prime Video told people, hey, disagree and commit. We are going back to the office. I don't have any data to support this, but regardless, I know it works, so let's do it. So that kind of decisions are completely clueless. First, because the principle of disagree and commit that you can use in many meetings to make decisions about really giving people a space to share their input, which in this case, it didn't happen. And the commitment is about once the people have a fair conversation, not to force alignment or impose a decision. So I think that that's part of the idea, that leaders get very anxious, at least in my experience, because they want to be right, they want to be in control. So they jump going through the difficult journey of iterating, learning, being intentional, take their time, listen to different voices, especially when they're going to be completely opposite to what they think.
We're really stuck by the our preference for current results as opposed to long-term results, because it's vastly more efficient to have the teams do some work to figure out when they should be together and when they should not, and then gather that data and make a sensible, purpose-driven policy. Because you don't have to whipsaw things. You don't have to rehire all the people who just quit. It's just way more cost effective and way more performant to do a return to office strategy based on some input and some intelligence and some iteration. And yet you have to think about it for many more months, and it freaks people out, so they just don't.
So but the point is, leaders sometimes make decisions on the exceptions, and this applies to rules. So basically, when something's broken, rather than fix that particular thing, they say, oh, because these people didn't respect a principle or whatever, we're going to change the rules for everyone. Today, I was talking to a client earlier on, and they've been working a very distributed way, and now they are realizing that they need people back to the office. For example, there are certain roles that at least 20% of their time, they need to be in the office, not because they want, but because they need to perform certain tasks that require taking care of equipment, so doing things in place. So what I was telling is that rather than trying to fly someone from the East Coast to the West Coast, which is not comfortable for the people, it's very expensive, why do you reassign that 20% of the responsibilities that role has into another role? So you free up that person and give them other responsibilities, so that role could operate 100% either hybrid or remote. So those are the things that I think people need to start thinking differently. The point is not how much time we spend where, it's about how we rethink the way we distribute and we organize work as well.
Right on. I had a conversation with a client that was similar, but on the other side. So they were looking to bring people back together because they are heavily in-person based, right? They do a lot of work with facilities, a lot of work with teams that need to perform their jobs in person. And they have support staff that work around them. So IT and HR and all of that. And IT and HR don't really need to necessarily be in the room. And they keep saying, hey, we don't need to come in to bond because we've seen that GitLab and Atlassian and all of these other companies can do a fabulous job without coming into space. Well, GitLab and Atlassian and all these other companies have years and years and years of having developed how they work and their systems, their Zapier, you know, all of their things where they've got single sources of truth documentation. They have clear meeting procedures, all of these things that this company did not have. So it really, when you're looking at the location first, you're looking at the wrong question, right? And very much like when you look at meetings as being about meetings or about being about calendar time or people's time in the room, you're looking at the wrong question, right? The question really needs to be, what is the function of what we do together collaboratively? And given what we have now, what's the best way to accomplish that? And if what we want to do is be mostly remote, what we want to do is to drive costs down or whatever, what needs to change in how we work and in how we are equipped for that to be possible?
So if I go back to our original framing question, you know, how to create a meeting positive culture, the common thread that I'm hearing actually from both of you is there's a requirement for adaptability, flexibility, but more importantly, it's adaptability and flexibility focused on the correct question. And is it fair to say that both of you are identifying that organizations very frequently focus on answering the wrong question when it comes to figuring out how they go about managing their meetings and conducting their meetings? Is that, am I interpreting correctly there?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So here's an example. I've had this in my queue to respond to forever, and I don't know if I can send this to you in the chat, but Adam Grant recently put out a post on LinkedIn. And Adam Grant is a social psychologist. His most famous book is called Think Again, which is really about looking at a situation and coming at it from a different angle, rethinking, reframing, right? And he runs a podcast, a very famous podcast, and he's going to do an episode on his work-life podcast about meetings. And here's how he framed the input he wants. I hate meetings. I would love to hear from you. What's the worst meeting you've ever attended? And what's your favorite way to make meetings not suck? So what do you think? What kind of answers are we going to get? What's kind of interventions? What kind of strategies do you get from, I hate this. What's awful about it? Is there any way for us to make it not suck? You know, and you can see it thousands, like 3,000 comments or something on this thing. Yeah. And most of the comments are comments about things that were irrelevant to the person who had to be there. Right. So the status meetings where everybody tells status and there are 40 people and nobody gets to speak. So that's a fundamental lack of design and lack of basic training in meetings. Yeah. Most of the replies, though, are about terrible behavior from individual people. You know, the boss who walks in and berates people. Yeah. You know, the coworker who comes in and cries on the table. You know, the client who's 20 minutes late and then yells at everybody. Like those kinds of things are not the meeting, right? That's having to work with an unpleasant person. So when you're asking this question and you're equating those things and you try to solve the problem of the terrible boss or the terrible client or whatever by canceling all your recurring meetings.
Yeah, but maybe the trite answer, maybe the trite answer and provocative answer to that question would be, we'll just stop having meetings and then let's see where that takes them. Because a bit like, we'll cancel the recurring meetings, but let's go another step. Let's just cancel all meetings. Let's just do away with meetings. Now, what are we going to do? So then we're going to focus on what problem have we got? What's the best way to solve it? Who needs to be involved in solving it? How long do we need to take to solve it? Okay, sounds like we're starting to set up a meeting flow. So maybe
teams try that. Like
and-
Salesforce has done it several times. They've just canceled all their meetings for several weeks at a time. And people send a lot of email for a couple of weeks and then can't wait to get back in. So it does, as long as it's an intervention without also asking the positively framed question, right? If you only start with a negative frame, it's very hard to get to anything except for a negative answer. When you start with a negative belief, you get a negative result.
Could I ask the same question of both of you, but actually I'll try and ask the same question, but from really completely opposite directions. So Gustavo, from an organization culture point of view, if an organization has a problem with its culture of whatever description, to what extent does it start by working on its meetings to address that? And the flip question, which is largely the same question, Elise, from when you're asked for meetings interventions, is it really what they're asking you to intervene on is our organization culture? I hope I'm asking the same thing, but I'm asking it from two really different sides of, I hope, the same coin.
Yeah, I think that first of all, meetings, it's a nice way to quickly get to learn about a company culture. So basically the bad behaviors quickly show up the same as the good behaviors. Yeah. And I agree with Elise that, for example, someone interrupts other, or they're very disrespectful, or they are bullying each other, that's not a meeting problem, right? It's a leadership problem or a cultural problem. I agree that when you start with asking a negative questions about meeting, people are going to rant. I do something, we have a couple of sessions about meetings with different consultants that we walk them through the process. And of course, we ask the question, what was the worst meeting to get that? And then we say, look, meetings are not either bad or wrong. They're just a necessary part. The point is, because certain meetings are really badly designed or are unnecessary or they're unproductive, then don't kill meetings for the sake of it. I like what you said earlier, that meetings are part of a continuum that has to do with collaboration, with decision-making, with creating strong interpersonal relationships, with giving feedback. And we shouldn't take them as a single unit. They're part of both asynchronous and synchronous communication work together. So I think that when we see meetings like one part, we're going back to that Band-Aid, fixing the symptom, right? To understand, okay, how can we collaborate better? How can we communicate better? How can we give feedback better? How can we innovate and come up with better ideas? And then when do we need a meeting or not as part of that dynamic?
Yeah, Elise?
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. Anytime somebody comes looking for improvements in their meetings, they are actually looking for help solving something that's fundamentally not functioning in their culture. Okay. And they've identified the meetings as the #1 blocker to making progress. So usually, and frankly, lots of people don't really come for help with their meetings because they assume that, oh, we know what we're supposed to be doing. We just need to do it, right? We know we're supposed to stay on time and keep it relevant and have an agenda. We just need to do it. So we don't need anybody to come talk to us about that. I think they're probably more likely to actually look for the cultural fix. The meetings are a great intervention point.
And interestingly, and this point has been raised in some of our previous conversations, to our knowledge, or certainly to my knowledge, no undergrad and no postgrad programs offer any form of meaningful schooling or tuition in meetings, in either running them, being part of them, managing them, organizing them, scheduling them. We just don't do that, which is extraordinary given the amount of time and resource that we put into meetings. And then we get the question that the guy you referred to there posed. You know, I hate them. What are we going to do about them? You kind of go, whoa, guys.
What can you expect?
Elise, I know I've spoken to you in the past about this concept, but when I was doing my own research on meetings, something struck me fairly profoundly, that meetings are the windows to the cultural soul of the organization. So if you want to see the organization in all its living glory, just look in the window of a few of its meetings, and you really quickly see what that culture is starting to look like and sound like. Would either of you or both of you have a comment on that?
I obviously think that's true, which is why I focus on meeting performance as my lens and intervention point.
Yeah.
Partially because that, right? You go into the meeting and you can say, I can see it. And when you talk about culture, we end up talking about words like, decision velocity and inclusion and safety and freedom and agile and all of these things, which are important and beautiful and huge and hard to put your fingers on. And when you get into the meeting, not only can you see culture, but you can do something about it, right?
Mm.
Like when I take 5 seconds at the beginning and we all take a deep breath and say, hey, it's really great to be here. I'm so glad to see you. Let's smile.
Mm.
That can shift a room. That is a very simple thing that I can do. Hey, how are we doing on a scale of 0 to 5, right? I'm doing a training series right now with the city here, and it's 60-minute trainings, dozens of them, all on Fist to 5. That's all we're doing. How do you check in with somebody? How are we doing? What's our confidence? That's it. That's it. And in that tiny, tiny, tiny practice that anybody can do, they're having all the conversations about, how do I deal with my boss who won't do this? How do I deal with the engineers who don't like to do anything that is not work related? Hey, can I do this with conservatives? Can I do this with women? Can I do this with a mayor? Like, yeah, it turns out they all can do this, but all of these questions about power and inclusivity and diversity and accessibility and all the big culture things. What does it mean if I disagree with somebody? Is that okay for me to do in a room? What if we don't all agree? How much time do we have to spend on it? Through a little tiny tangible thing that you can grab and you can do. That's powerful. So yes, you can see it, and yes, you can change it. And that's cool.
And meetings are where the organization comes together to communicate, to engage, to connect. And that's where that power base lies in the meeting. It's an intervention point. Is that a fair point to say? Yeah. Okay. Gustavo, looking at it from the flip side, looking at it from the pure cultural side, and then saying, okay, are the meetings a fair window to the soul of the organization?
Definitely. For me, and the model I use, meetings are part of the culture. They're one of the elements. So it's not just about values and things that people usually spend a lot of time talking, but actually don't move the needle. I like that metaphor of the window of the soul. And one thing about our soul, neither of us has a white or black soul. We have lots of a kind of a spectrum of grace, if you wish. And I think one of the interesting things for me that I put a lot of attention to is how people manage conflict. How do they manage dissent? So I was intrigued about the positive term that we use for this particular gathering. And sometimes positive lately on has been more of a toxic positivity. So we all need to agree with each other. We all need to like each other and blah, blah, blah. One thing is respect for the individual, but other thing it's disagreeing with their ideas. And I think for me, it's important that many people feel that when there's conflict, when there's tension within a team, that's ineffective. And for me, it's on the contrary, more about facilitating conflict in a respectful and functional way for people to actually be able to present different viewpoints, to challenge each other, and then get to better outcomes. So there are many meetings that people qualify them as, oh, they're great because basically they look nice, people enjoy them, they were happy, but then when you look at the outcome, both from a team and solutions or whatever they were looking, decision perspective, they fail. So I think it's important to also address that element. And also, Elise talk about inclusivity, whatever. I think a lot of companies and teams I'm working with a couple of companies that they keep bringing up the idea we're weaponizing those elements, those positive elements. So people can do whatever. Well, what about being together? We're one single culture. So they're using the culture lingo to do whatever they want, but in the end, they're harming their relationships, they're harming the team, they're harming the work.
Yeah, wow.
That's amazing. And Martin, I'm conscious of the time.
Oh,
If I
yeah,
may step
absolutely.
in and take advantage of these two great guests that we have here. And it's I'm at all listening to them speaking at each other sometimes without even you intervening, Martin.
Sure.
And it's amazing to see this expertise here on our show today. My question to you, though, it will be on something that I'm still surprised to see how little evidence management has in relation to meetings. And I'm talking about a dashboard that could tell you in advance that your regular meetings are failing. And so you will have a compelling reason to take a decision, right? But not like, I think that, let's do 3 days a week because I feel that's going to work. So how about your experience and your views on these tools that could help managers on having hard data, hard evidence on meeting performance and reasons to change anything on meetings?
I have a lot of strong opinions on this, and this could be a very, very long conversation. I think Gustavo and I both recently have been I've been doing a lot of training on using consent, not consensus, and other ways in which to do productive conflict, productive, right-sized conversations so that you can you can advance what you're doing. And I have to say, in regards to all of these dashboards, there is not a consensus or even consent on what it is we should be measuring. We don't have the disagree and commit to metrics that are meaningful at the cultural level that we're discussing. So the dashboards and the tools are really good at doing things like looking at flow time, the amount of time you spend in meetings versus other kinds of work, recovery, which is how much time you have between meetings to get one glass of water, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right. They can look at whether you have an agenda, whether you have a purpose, did people show up, were you on time, all of that kind of stuff. And that's table stakes. Table stakes, not even from the gambling, I have enough to be in the game, but from the table manners kind of level. We're able to measure whether or not people can sit politely and do some basic hygiene things, which does not have a significant impact on these larger cultural questions of whether the conversation we're having is meaningful to our goals. When we invite people and include people and they participate, should they have been invited and included and participated? Is it relevant to them? Is it relevant to our work? Are we creative? Are we innovative? Are we honest? Are we in integrity? Are we profitable? All of these things are what meetings are meant to do. And the tools aren't there yet. When the tools become able to be tuned to what you're doing, and there are some that are. So if you look at Gong or some of the other tools that are tuned specifically to the sales conversation.
Mm-hmm.
My job is to make you buy something that we can measure, right? How fast do you do it? How many meetings do you need to be in before they invite the rest of your team to increase your chance of a win, right? When win is clear, then the tools are useful. And until companies learn how to make the win clear for the rest of their meetings, the tools are premature.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the focal point of the tools is really the determining factor whether the tools are useful or not. That's, yeah, okay.
In my opinion.
Gustavo?
I would add that building on that same stuff, I think that because it's easy to measure things, so the point is everything can be measured. That doesn't mean that everything should be measured. And I think that companies are abusing metrics because they're an easy way to cover problems and other parts of our body too. So basically we have numbers. First of all, they're measuring the wrong things. I agree with Elise, but also they're lumping in all the information together. So rather than try to identify what's happening in different groups, they bring all the information together. So it's the lowest common denominator. You don't really get to have a grasp on what's going on. Also, I think there's a lot of emphasis into the process, no? The how, as we're saying, how many people, how long do meetings versus focusing more on the why. Why do we need to meet? What are we trying to achieve? Where are we here? And what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? And are we achieving it or not? And for every meeting that changes. I think that for me, I like to find simple metrics to get started. Not that I don't like the quantitative data, but I think that human behavior is the most quickest way to understand. So for example, making meetings optional. So if people don't show up, it's like if you're having a party and you invite people, it's your birthday, no one shows up. Well, maybe you don't have friends, you invited the wrong people, or maybe, there are many reasons. So with meetings, exactly the same. When people are not forced, if they really appreciate being there, they're going to show up. And if not, maybe either you need to cancel the meeting, you need to redesign it, you need to invite different people, but there's something wrong with that. And that for me is a nice symptom. How are people interested in showing up or not?
I love that
meetings
rule.
and experience. Also, how can you, if you don't make the meeting sexy enough for people to join, then it's up on you, not on people. So, and then the metrics are measuring what people are doing versus what the meeting organizer, the host, not the owner, because I hate the term meeting owner. It feels that the meeting's for one person rather from the guests. No, it's like if you do a party, don't do it for you, do it for your guests. The same applies to meetings.
So it actually sounds like that question, Paul, is sufficiently provocative that we could have an entire conversation just on that question of measuring meetings. Mm-hmm. And you could just leave it at that, just measuring meetings, ... because there's so much in what both of you have just said in the last 3 minutes. We can't continue that conversation, unfortunately. But Paul, we might just take note of it because I think Elise and Gustavo might just have fed us the next theme for our next conversation, because it's a fascinating topic. Mindful of our time, guys, we're approaching 50 minutes, believe it or not, and time has really flown on this one. I normally try to do a very quick summary, but what a rich conversation. It started with a question: how do we build a positive organization meeting positive organization culture? But actually what kicked us off was Gustavo wandering around in the outback, not sure where he was, and wondering about how the mountain lions might come and have him for breakfast. But in actual fact, that was really provocative thought, because that brought us into managing the unknown, dealing with the possibilities of the unknown. But then before you can do that well, you need to become comfortable with the unknown. And the idea then of culture constraining organization meetings because of our rigidity with the format, with the method, with the process, and the possibility then that we might just be losing sight of, but why are we meeting? Is the form of meeting that we're actually proposing to use best fit to meet the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve? Extending that, we talked more then about the idea of organizations shifting towards more ad hoc type meetings. Elise, you touched on this point for us. and that can be a symptom, a clear enough symptom, that actually the current structured way that we have of managing and running our organizational meetings just may not be fit for purpose. So people spontaneously move to an ad hoc form in order to meet their real needs. And their real needs then might help to focus them in more productive use of their time, rather than sticking with staid or stale meeting procedures that just don't meet expectations or needs. Elise, you also then took us into the idea of the 3 levels in the organization. So the executive C-suite, the teams-based level, but then the concept of iterations. And Gustavo, you picked up on the importance and significance of that iteration piece, which then becomes a key driver of managing the organization's cultural shifts through its organizational meetings. I mentioned then the possibility that meetings can be seen as windows to the soul, to the cultural soul of the organization. Both of you agreed with that concept or that proposition. And I suppose where that took us in our conversation was then to say, actually, maybe when we're convening our meetings, and maybe to become meeting positive, maybe we need to shift the focus of the questions that we're trying to address or trying to answer within any particular or given meeting, either a meeting individually or a flow of meetings that might happen within a team or a group or an organization. So shifting our focus to what question are we trying to answer might be a really significant point to building a meeting positive culture. Because by addressing that question, we have a significant chance of actually carrying out meetings in a way that meet people's needs. And Gustavo, you focused in our latter part of our conversation on focus on the outcomes, focus on what are we trying to achieve, and then matching how we go about conducting our business to actually deliver that outcome that we're actually looking for. A final point that I think both of you made in slightly different ways is that managing conflict and consent is actually a fundamental and a core part of what an organization needs to do and what meetings are used as a vehicle to do. But most importantly, a key takeaway that I'm getting from it is respect for the individuals can be fundamentally different to having differences of ideas or differences of opinion. And we can absolutely figure out how to manage our differences without ever compromising the fundamental respect that we show for every individual that's participating. I hope that summary has done some justice to a really, really interesting conversation. And thank you both very much for joining us on it.
That was an amazing summary. And before you go, Elise and Gustavo, perhaps we could have just a note for the viewers on LinkedIn. You know, they could be busy managers. They could be actually government officials, right? Because we mentioned the project, Elise, you're working with your CTO. But government officials, they might suffer for the lack of the desired meeting culture they would wish in the first place. What will be your piece of advice before we go?
I'd say look at your very next 5 meetings on your calendar and get clear on your purpose. Start small and iterate, right? How can I make each of these conversations a beautiful experience? Productive, rich, and that we're better for it when we come out the end. Start there and then call one of us, because we got all kinds of help to give.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one. That's for the Miller. So that, I don't know what to add, but basically, I think that meetings are a social event that we human beings need. So we do it right, they're going to help us. So in that sense, invite people to provide input. So I would say, ask your team, what are the things that are getting in the way for us to having better meetings? So don't talk about what meetings are bad, complain. So what are the hurdles, the speed bumps, whatever there is that we need to take care of to start improving our meetings? So rather than look at perfect meetings, how could we increase maybe the meetings that we have by 15%? That will be that will create a huge impact.
And embrace the Salvador Dali quote, right? Have no fear of perfection. You'll never reach it.
Because you're not Dali.
Not happening. Not happening.
No,
So you might as well go for it.
Wow, this is a great way to end up this meeting, as we have a beautiful picture of everybody smiling here. And Martin, over to you, and thank you so much for the summary, Martin. But over to you to close this today.
Yeah, what a fantastic conversation, guys. It was really super to have you coming at this topic from mutually complementary but fundamentally different perspectives. But actually, I was really intrigued and really happy that we met in a really important place, I think. And perhaps that idea that meetings are windows to the soul, the cultural soul of the organization. Maybe if that's an overarching takeaway, we can either approach our meetings or approach our culture from either perspective, but actually we're going to end up in the same place at the end. Hopefully better organizations and better meetings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.